All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have with us the Undersecretary General for Policy, and he's also the UN lead for the Summit of the Future, Mr. Guy Ryder. Thank you for joining us. As you know, he's here to brief you on the Summit of the Future. I'm sure you have a lot of questions on that, and he will start with some introductory remarks, and then we'll turn it over to you guys. Please, Mr. Ryder.
Thanks very much, Francia, and greetings to everybody here. Thank you for your interest in the Summit of the Future. Let me give you a brief sort of state of play on the summit and why we think it is so important. You know, the summit is a matter of days away now. It takes place on the 22nd and the 23rd of September, preceded by a day and a half of action days where we're bringing stakeholders into the building to discuss the relevant issues. We're expecting in excess of 130 heads of state, heads of government to attend the summit. And in the action days, we have registrations for in excess of 7,000 NGOs, academics, private sector representatives. We think this is indicative of a very high level of interest in the summit. And let me, turning to the substance of the summit, say that we believe that the stakes are high, that the issues on the table of the summit are of the greatest importance to not just the UN system and multilateralism, but to the future of our member states as well. And let me tell you where we stand in the negotiating process, with a reminder that the summit will be adopting 3 outcome documents: a Pact for the Future, to which will be annexed 2 other documents, a Global Digital Compact and a Declaration on Future Generations. The overall objective of the summit, and people ask this question quite frequently, is very simply stated. The idea of the summit is to render the United Nations, the multilateral system, more effective in the fulfillment of its mandate, to make it more participatory, more networked. This in the face of the very clear global challenges that we face, the fact that the world has changed and is changing rapidly, and the reality that many of our governance structures date back to the creation of the United Nations, when it had 51 member states instead of the 193 member states who will be gathering at the summit itself. Now, substantially, what are we going to find in these outcome documents? What are the issues being addressed? In the Pact for the Future itself, the mother document, if I can call it that, there are 5 chapters, and I'm not going to take you through them in grinding detail, but simply to highlight what seem to be some of the most important issues at stake. We have a major section on sustainable development and financing of sustainable development. Very clear signal that part of the objective of this summit is to complete and to improve our business around the 2030 agenda. This is an accelerator for the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, with an important access on financing, which is a recurrent theme, I would say, throughout the summit process. Secondly, we have a section on peace and security, designed in accordance with proposals presented by the Secretary General under the title of A New Agenda for Peace, to address the whole spectrum, the whole continuum of peace. Conclusions that would address root causes, place an emphasis on prevention, look at an update of our peacekeeping, peace-building operations, but also address, critically I think, new and emerging conflict domains. So think of the application of new technologies in lethal weapons, think of biological hazards, think about the dangers of the militarization of outer space. All of these are being addressed. A third chapter is on science, technology, and innovation. And of course, this is where the annex on the Global Digital Compact comes into play. If I could put it in a word or a sentence, the objective of the Global Digital Compact is to make technology work for humanity equitably. We are aiming at closing digital divides, expanding inclusion in the digital economy, creating an inclusive, open, safe, and secure digital space, working on equitable data governance, and also, and this has perhaps attracted more attention than anything else, creating the systems of governance of artificial intelligence that will benefit humanity. A fourth section is on youth and future generations. There is a very strong emphasis on youth throughout the summit and in the action days that precede it. And the sections on youth and future generations, two quite distinct groups I would underline to you. It's firstly to increase the participation opportunities for youth in decision-making nationally and in the UN system, and to address the key social and economic challenges facing young people. A declaration on future generations is intended to codify what is happening in many of our member states, the need to ensure that decisions we take today take into full account the needs and interests of future generations. And the last chapter, and it captures a lot of different issues, is around the transformation of global governance. This is a very wide-ranging area of the Pact. It addresses Security Council reform, and we have the potential to take important steps forward on Security Council reform. It addresses the revitalization of the General Assembly and ECOSOC. Critically, it contains extensive language at the current state of negotiations on reform of the international financial architecture. I would say one of the most important and certainly one of the most contested areas of the Pact for the Future, and goes on, for example, into the governance of outer space issues, new approaches to outer space traffic, debris, and of course this issue of militarization. I think you will see from this that we have a very ambitious agenda. The ambitions for this summit have always been high. What I think is very encouraging, 10 days out from the summit, is that the negotiations which are continuing on documents which meet that high level of ambition. Now, the negotiations are incomplete. The member states are working hard to reach the necessary consensus on these documents. We need consensus for adoption. But I think there is good reason to be confident that the successful conclusion of these negotiations will produce a pact with 2 annexes that will truly make a difference. This is something which is not only worth having, it is something that we need to secure for the future. A last word, and I will conclude. The action days that precede the summit itself are in consonance with the efforts we have made from the outset to ensure the involvement of multi-stakeholders in this process. There was a major civil society conference in Kenya in May, but I would include also the private sector, academia, the scientific community. We're bringing them together for a day and a half. On the Friday before the summit, we will have quite deliberately kicking off with a youth-led session, and then going into a session which reflect the main themes of the summit. And messages from these action days will be brought to the attention of the summit as well. So we hope this creates a cohesive set of events that will lead us where we need to get. I will leave it there, Florencia, and of course, very happy to try to respond to your questions.
Okay, so I'll start by taking questions in the room, and for those asking online, yes, we will take questions online as well. We'll start with Amélie, please.
Thank you very much for the briefing. Amélie Bottelier from AFP News Agency. You said it, the stakes are high, and the event has a big name, Summit of the Future. The document has a big name, Pact of the Future. But objectively, reading the outcome document, even if you say that it could be improved a little bit in the next 10 days, it's a list of commitments that are commitments to things that already exist, recommitment to previous commitments. And a lot of experts, observers, and diplomats basically describe it as not as a visionary document. So how do you expect it to make a real change?
Well, respectfully, I disagree. Disagree with that characterization of the document, and it doesn't correspond to what's on the table. It isn't a simple recommitment to things that have been done in the past. Look at the language on draft language. Everything I say is caveated by the fact that negotiations are incomplete. The language on international financial architecture reform has not been on the table before. Just not the case. The language on Security Council reform is seen by those who have formulated it in the IGN process as groundbreaking, as potentially the biggest step forward since the 1960s. The commitments around peace and security, clearly a review will be coming on our peace operations, but we are addressing emerging new domains of conflict in ways which they've not been addressed before. It's simply not the case. So the idea that we're just, going back over ground that's already been covered, I just don't think stands up to examination. But we have to secure these results. So I'm going to repeat what I said. This is a document which retains, I think, a very commendable level of ambition. There were things everybody would like to have, not everybody, but some people would like to have more of, some people would like to have less of. That is the nature of multilateral negotiations. But I think that what we have before us is something which is potentially very important. If I look beyond the Pact itself to the Global Compact, artificial intelligence governance has not ever been addressed in the way that's addressed in the Global Digital Compact. Commitment to future generations has never been addressed. This is not simply covering well-trodden ground. It's not the case.
Okay, great. Deji?
Yes, Ms. Ryder. First question I ask everybody, so you're the next one. Can you explain what summit? I think this is totally good. The question for you. Can you explain what the Summit of the Future is to our audience in a very interesting way? Because we know you just explained it, but how to attract normal people attention, not the politicians. And secondly, I disagree respectfully with your disagreement. But we saw all those agendas and actions, SDG acceleration agenda, new agenda for peace. We heard a lot of those, reform of the Security Council. But let me put that aside. If we have this Pact of Future, how much can we expect the implementation of this very important document? And third, this is obviously a watered-down, compromised version of Pact of the Future. How far away is this from Secretary General's imagination or, expectation? Thank you.
I always try to say things in an interesting way, not just for the people in this room, but for the world in general. Look, there is always, is there not, this thought that whatever happens in this building and in multilateral negotiations is rather distant from people's realities, everyday life. That's the nature of multilateral negotiations. So you have to scratch beneath the surface. You have to go underneath the formalities and sometimes language which is not easily accessible. But if we succeed in getting agreement from 193 member states on actions that will secure governance of new technologies that will spread benefits much more widely through inclusion, through connectivity, through the governance of artificial intelligence. If we're able, you've heard it before, to accelerate SDGs, if we're able to revamp the United Nations peace operations, if we are able to initiate the changes that will make the Security Council more effective, yes, this will influence people's lives. Will it happen the day after the Pact is gavelled? No. It needs, and you pointed to the key here, it needs implementation. It needs implementation. And I think I have to recognise, looking at the content of the Pact, which I still want to commend to you as a very positive thing, that a great deal depends on what happens with the commitments that are made, the implementation. So I follow you entirely that everything depends on the level of implementation. You've made the point. Security Council reform, we've heard it before. SG, we've heard it before. But it's not the questions, it's the answers. There are new answers to the questions contained in this pact. And that is what makes it not just worth having, but very important to have.
How far away from the expectation of safety?
Sorry. You can judge for yourself by a very easy process. Last year, the Secretary-General published 11 policy briefs, which were his proposals to the summit. This is what he ideally would have liked to see. And he was very clear. He said, these are what I believe are the proper ambitions we should reach for. And he made those proposals in full cognizance of the fact that not all of these would meet with the agreement of member states. I leave it to you to take those policy briefs, look at the Pact for the Future as we hope it will be adopted in 10 days' time, and measure the gap. They are not identical. It would be futile to say that they are. But what is interesting is that the contours and structure of the Pact follow very clearly the content of those policy briefs. So the SG has set the content agenda in a very, very, I think, successful way.
Okay, next question, Ephraim, and then Gabriel.
Thanks, Florentia. Thank you, Mr. Ryder. Could you please, two quick questions. You just said that there's been groundbreaking language on Security Council reforms. Could you please say what is groundbreaking about the new language? Last time I checked, I may be completely mistaken, but the only thing that came out in the document is that there will be an office here at the Secretariat that deals with Security Council reforms. And is there something else? What is groundbreaking about it? And second, you said, and we know that the negotiations are not over yet. Could you say something about what the remaining sticking points are and the hurdles to the unanimity, which you say is very needed? Thank you.
Yeah. Let me take your questions in reverse order. By definition, we need a consensus because that's what our modalities resolution is. It's not a matter at the discretion of anybody. We need to have everybody on board. And that is, of course, a high bar to get over. Negotiations on all three of the outcome documents are continuing. They are quite intense. I think there's a strong focus on different parts of the Pact for the Future, where I have to recognize there are a significant number of issues that have still to be resolved. Now, it would not be helpful for me to go into the detail of areas of contention because it might prejudice, I think, the process in a way I would not wish to do. But we are aware that there are issues that from the beginning, partly because they are so important, are very difficult. Reform of the international financial architecture is one. The manner in which climate and climate finance is addressed, because we're meeting on, there's a contextual problem. We're meeting on the eve of COP29, and we're not trying to do the job of COP29, and that creates a contextual complication. Some of the areas of disarmament, nuclear disarmament in particular, are also difficult. That's not, regrettably, that's not an exclusive list of difficulties. But what I can say is that the co-facilitators on the Pact, that is the governments of Germany and Namibia, are convening very intensive negotiating processes as we speak. By the end of this week, we hope to have another draft of the Pact, and the intention would be for that to meet with the type of consensus that we require. Now, very properly and understandably, you want to know a little bit more about why the language on Security Council reform is important. Now, let me say, groundbreaking. I think groundbreaking is a word I will stick by. It's not just about creating an office. It's not about that. That's not even part of really of what matters. There is a commitment to addressing historic injustice against Africa, improving representation of Asia Pacific, Latin America on the Council, new language. There is a commitment to the enlargement of the Council to be more representative of current UN membership. There is commitment to intensify efforts to find an agreement on categories of membership and the intention to develop a consolidated model of reform. Now, this might sound rather esoteric. This would be one of the difficult things to explain to the person in the street. But for those engaged in this type of process since the 1960s, and I think that the co-facilitators of negotiations, Austria and Kuwait, recognize this as groundbreaking language, which appears at this point to have the broad consensus subject to confirmation of our member states. So I think it is fair, it's not hyperbole, it is fair to say that this is breaking new ground.
Okay, we'll go to Gabriel, and then I'll take a couple of questions online.
Thank you, Florencia. Thank you, Mr. Ryder, for the briefing. It's very helpful. Two questions. Gabriel Elizondo from Al Jazeera, English. Two questions. One is, when the summit is over, how will you judge if it was successful or not? by what parameters will you use? And my second question is on AI. I wanted to follow up on that. Can you just flesh out a little bit more on the language related to AI and specifically why the AI issue is so important to be put in the agenda? Thank you.
Your first question, which is a good one and almost impossible to answer, is, I mean, how would we judge if this has been important? I would say that if, judging from where we stand today, the key issues that I've tried to outline to you, which have been sort of built into the Pact process from the outset, are able to be adopted in something close to the form they are in now, that will be important and worth having. But there is a caveat attached to all of this. That language has to lead to action. Now, it is not by accident that the Pact has been framed in terms of areas of action. I would underline the word action. But adopting a document is not an action in itself, it's a commitment to action. So the success of the summit, I would say, would be difficult to evaluate more than provisionally as the gavel comes down on the end of the summit. I think we ought to have this conversation 1 year on from there to see the extent to which this has influenced the behavior of member states and the dynamics of the multilateral system. On artificial intelligence, and yes, it's probably been the part of the Global Digital Compact which has attracted most attention. There are a number of very concrete and I think important proposals on the table. One is the establishment of a scientific panel on the governance of artificial intelligence. You can think of perhaps some precedents in the field of climate change where the notion of scientific opinion being codified is important, and also the notion of establishing a global dialogue, very much a conversation, a convening by the UN of a global dialogue on the future of AI. Proposals as well to establish, or rather to build upon the existing Tech Envoy's office and make this an office for coordination of UN system efforts around emerging technologies. If you put these things together, I think you will see that these are important areas. And let me just perhaps quote one statistic at you, which comes out of the High-Level Advisory Board on Artificial Intelligence, which has already met and will be reporting on the eve, the Secretary-General's High-Level Advisory Panel on AI. In its mapping of existing AI initiatives, it has reported that of the, I think, 7 international initiatives on AI, which it has looked at, 7 countries, 7 of our member states are involved in all 7 of those initiatives. 118 of our member states are involved in none of them. The only locus where you can have universal involvement in governance of AI discussions is this place. And that is why we believe that establishing an agreed role for the UN in this area is so very important.
Great. I'm going to take a couple questions online. We'll start with Maya Plants from the UN Brief.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my question, Secretary General. It is really a pleasure to see you, Mr. Ryder. I am asking a question that has been asked in several instances, is why this focus on youth when women have been underrepresented, is a demographic that is underrepresented at the UN in many fora still, and why is this of late this almost obsessive focus with youth only, when we have half of the world's population that are women?
I'm tempted to, thank you for your question. I'm tempted to paraphrase it by saying it's not so much why youth, but why not women, in a sense. And you give me a proper opportunity to say something which I failed to say at the outset. Gender issues, empowerment of women and girls, as well as human rights issues, are designated and have been from the modalities resolution as cross-cutting issues in the Pact and in its annexes. So it is not that the Pact is silent or gender blind. Women and human rights issues are very much part of the Pact. I can quote different areas where that is the case, including women in peace and security, and the access of women to new technologies. Obsessive attention to youth, I would contest the notion of obsessive, but a very determined focus on youth. Not accidental, springing, I think, from a strong conviction of the Secretary-General, without excluding any other constituency which merits our attention, that we need to do more to involve young people in UN processes and national policy processes. And the section of the Pact relating to youth addresses both of those things. And the Action Day will kick off with a session led by youth, led by the new, still relatively new, Assistant Secretary-General for Youth, who is already an advanced byproduct of the Pact for the Future process, the summit process, appointed by the Secretary-General. Let's face it, we're in a world where there is a danger not only that because of their economic and social challenges, young people feel disillusioned and marginalized from political public life, but also where paths to their participation are often closed or unsatisfactory. The Secretary-General is absolutely determined to redress those deficiencies, and that's where I think the very strong accent on youth participation springs from. But I repeat, this is not to the exclusion, for example, of women's and girls' empowerment and gender issues and equality issues.
Thank you. We'll take Yoshida from Press Trust of India.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mr. Ryder, for this briefing. Yoshida Singh from Press Trust of India. I have a question on UN Security Council reforms as well. The UN will be 80 years next year, and there have been negotiations on the UNSC reform. We all know where they are headed or how far they've come. How do you think the Summit of the Future and language on UNSC reform will propel action on this? Is there a timeline? Will there be stock-taking assessment after the summit to point out to how much the needle has moved in the years, or will it be another endless wait? Thank you.
Well, obviously, I empathize with the sense and the intent of the question. It has been a very, very long process, and results have not yet been forthcoming, at least not in the nature that a number of our member states rightly wish. I can only reiterate, there aren't timelines attached to the language currently under negotiation. I have to be quite explicit about that. But at the risk of repeating what I have already said in answer to questions, there is a genuine sentiment, and the fact that the language apparently has the consensus of all parties is testimony to what I am saying, that what is being agreed, or hopefully will be agreed in the Pact for the Future in 10 days' time, does open new doors, does offer the hope that this will not be, as you phrased it, an endless quest for results. It is not the result in and of itself. It is not the end of the road. It's proper to recognize that. But hopefully it represents progress towards those results.
Great. We'll turn it back to the room over here, and then we'll go to Dulcie.
Hi, Mr. Ryder. Jamil Shadi from Brazil. Good to see you. My question is about the link between climate change and security. Some countries are not extremely happy with this link. Why do you think a pact of the future needs a link between security and climate change, and whether this would perhaps undermine the mandate of other institutions that actually have the mandate to deal with climate change? And then last one, since you're talking about Security Council, do you think the Security Council is the correct place to talk about climate change? Thank you.
Well, the question is absolutely right. Good to see you again. That the question of the interaction between climate change, peace and security issues is a matter of contention. It is still being discussed. It is still being negotiated. So I have to acknowledge that this is not one of the easiest areas to deal with, and that there are divergent opinions in relation to this relationship. So I don't want to get in the middle of a discussion where member states are still looking for common ground. But even if the relationship, and knowing the country you come from, you can imagine some of the conversations that I've had, I think there is a feeling that we don't need to simplify this relationship. There isn't an automatic nature of relationship, but we do, I think, in many areas, have a strong body of opinion which says that we are seeing that climate change, the displacement of people through climate change, is a contributing factor to conflict, is a contributing issue when it comes to addressing peace and security. Now, wherever you fall in answer to those questions, I think determines whether or not you believe the Security Council is the right place to address climate change issues. And I really can't venture further than to recognize that logical consequence of the discussion now underway.
Great. Dulcie?
Thanks very much. I have a technical question. When is the deadline for the Pact of the Futures to be confirmed or firmed up?
The intention is that the Pact itself and its two annexes will be adopted at the outset of the summit, at the opening of the summit. So we are, and all efforts are being directed to securing consensus around the documents in time for the opening of the summit.
Okay, and how would you, there is some anxiety among some diplomats, primarily in the West, that Russia will obstruct consensus on the Pact for the Future, particularly on issues related to IFI and climate and security, apparently. So I know you don't want to wade into this kind of discussion, but how would you characterize the possibility that the Pact does not get off the ground? Thanks.
Until we have the consensus in the bag, that possibility always exists, and it's good to operate on the understanding that we have to work very, very hard to secure a consensus which, I repeat, is not yet there on any of the three outcome documents. But I remain of the view that there is a very, very strong sentiment amongst our membership, notwithstanding areas of continuing divergence, that it is important and it is the will of member states that successful outcomes are secured. And of course, we're here to help the things along in the Secretariat. I remain confident that the level of commitment to this process is such that it will not be beyond our capacities to secure the consensus required. And yes, you've mentioned a number of particular obstacles in our way. They are real, and we are trying to address them.
Great. I'm mindful of the time, so we'll take one last question.
Thank you for the briefing, Mr. Ryder. This is Augusta Saraiva from Bloomberg News. A couple of questions. So you said we should ask you a year from now about how successful the summit was. So in terms of the implementation, should we expect to see any mechanisms in place to track that? And then a second question, if you could just speak a little bit more about the importance of also focusing on long-term goals when we have so many urgent issues that need our attention right now.
Look, in terms of follow-up, thank you. I think it's very important. I think you can categorize these sort of in two ways. One is that there are already in the future calendar events and processes into which the outcome of the Pact will naturally feed. So when it comes, for example, to reform of the international financial architecture, we have the Financing for Development conference mid-year in Spain. We are moving towards a World Social Summit at the end, in November of next year. There are processes into which these things will naturally feed. But there will be other processes, if the Pact is adopted in something approaching its existing form, that will create processes of their own. So, for example, on outer space governance, we could be putting in place a whole new process to discuss those matters. In some of the disarmament areas, a similar point could be made. On peace and security, we will have the Secretary General has been asked to initiate a review of peace operations. If the Global Digital Compact is adopted in something like its existing form, we will have a whole series of processes around artificial intelligence and the like. So, and I think this is an important point to make, when it comes to implementation, this pact sort of presses the button on a whole series of processes that would be initiated. And I think that I rather pulled out that 1 year ahead rather randomly, but I think it is not a bad time frame in which to look at these things. The other point you raise is something that's been there from the beginning. Does it make sense to look at problems of the future when there are so many pressing problems of today? I have to say I don't think that that dichotomy really exists in reality, because it's addressing the problems that we have before us today in ways which are sensitive to the more longer-term future generations perspective, that we're going to come up with credible and sustainable solutions. So, you know, this dichotomy was raised even when the Summit of the Future was first being conceived, that really we should keep our eye on the ball of today's problems, the SDGs, and not sort of look over the horizon to things that might happen to the next generation. But it's not like that. It's not like that. And I think what I've said about the Summit of the Future being consciously directed inter alia, delivering on today's 2030 agenda issues, I think is evidence for the way we've reconciled, not had to reconcile, because it's just like that, the current and the future.
Okay, great. I think that's a great note to end it. Thank you very much, Mr. Ryder. Thank you, everybody.